Hello again, 121. In this video, I'm going to go over Chapter 14, New Encounters and the Creation of a World Market. And many of the outcome questions will be answered in the course of this discussion. This is the age of exploration now for the Europeans and a time of expansion. And basically the answer to that first question is that many East Asians and Southeast Asians, more Southeast Asians, are going to become Muslim because of the influence of Changhua and those Chinese vessels that went through the Strait of Malacca, which is the avenue of trade in the 13th and 14th centuries. Paramesvara, undoubtedly with a view to enhancing Malacca's ability to participate in the trade that passed through the strait, much of which was dominated by Muslim merchants, he converted, as other Hindus did, from the original influence on this part of the world. And from here, you have access into India, which would be up in this area, and then further west to Africa. What do they want? They want those spices because this is an age before refrigeration, ladies and gentlemen. Spices are very useful in preserving foods. And they're very, very, they have great value because of their use in, not just in making food taste better, but also in preservation of foods. Marco Polo was one of the first Europeans to go to China, and he spurred great interest when he finally returned after spending over a generation at the court of Kublai Khan. He also went to Japan and talked of his adventures there. And from that time on, Europeans now, from the 13th century on, have an interest in, once again, as they did during the Silk Road era 100 years previously, now that once again they are interested in relations with the East. The voyages of Vasco da Gama of Portugal in 1498 spurred new interest also. He was the first one to go all the way around the tip of Africa to India. Bartholomew Diaz stopped and returned to Portugal. Why were the Portuguese, this little country in Europe, why were they so successful in taking over this trade? They're seeking greater wealth. And there is a tremendous market for these spices. From the time after the Crusade, there is never-ending demand for these items. And to avoid having to use the caravan route that was done on the Silk Road, they are seeking a direct sea route to Asia. And some of the technological advances are going to aid them in finding that sea route. They developed the Caravel sailing ship that enables them to sail against the wind, which eases travel. The astrolabe, which was invented already by the Muslims, allowed location latitudinally to be determined. And also, as we've talked about, the magnetic compass of the Chinese is now something that is desired by Europeans in order to aid sea travel. There's also improved maps by the end of the 1400s, and there's a growing knowledge of the wind patterns in the Atlantic that allows for an easier return to Europe. And finally, remember this slogan, God, glory, and gold is the spiritual motivation for the age of exploration. We're going to convert people to Catholicism. We're going to enrich ourselves in the process, and in so doing bring glory to these new nation states now that are developing from the 1400s on. Spain is going to take this over eventually. And how did they acquire their overseas empires? Prince Henry the Navigator opened a school in southwest Portugal in the early 1400s, and they engaged in all of these seafaring activities. And the slave trade begins at this time. As I mentioned, Diaz was the first to go around Good Hope, but he turned around, and Da Gama will then complete the trip to India. Be familiar with those two European explorers. In the search for spices in the early 16th century, d'Albuquerque established a port at Goa, which is on the west coast of India, and that's going to remain a Portuguese outpost into the 20th century. They basically take these areas in Southeast Asia. They were very ruthless and vicious in their actions. And when they established ports, that helped to break the Italian Muslim monopoly on the Asian trade. It's no longer the Italian city-states then dominating this trade with the East. What are some of the consequences? As you're all familiar with probably from elementary school, Columbus was one of the first Europeans to reach the Americas, and the rest of his life he thought he had found the Far East. Instead, the explorers and navigators after him realized that he had found a different region. Cabral discovered the coast of South America from a European point of view, obviously, and Amerigo Vespucci, the Italian, wrote many letters with really detailed maps, and the publications of his letters led to the use of America after his first name to describe these new lands to the Europeans. There's tension between Spain and Portugal, and eventually the line of demarcation pronounced by Pope Alexander VI said that anything west of this line of longitude running north and south, all those lands will belong to Spain. All lands east belong to Portugal, and that's why Brazil became a Portuguese colony and why they still speak Portuguese there to this day. And everything west of there became Spanish oriented, and the Spanish language was used. Treaty of Tordesillas marked the agreement on this line of demarcation. Be familiar with that. It's a very huge historical event in European history. The conquistadors will be the Spanish explorers who will attempt to implement this idea of God, glory, and gold. The Aztecs thought they were gods when they first saw them because they were riding horses, an animal they had never seen. And because of the clothing they were wearing with the chainmail and the suits of armor and the feathers out of the top of their helmets, they believed that they were the serpent god of their religions. And these are vastly different portrayals of Cortez and his contact with the Aztecs. Right, they're civilizing them in this one, and where this is done by Native Americans, and that depicts what it really was. It was conquest. They demand them to convert, and they eventually make alliances with rival indigenous populations that don't get along with the Aztecs, and they slowly destroy them. In South America, in the top south or northwest part of South Americas, that was the traditional Inca Empire, and Pizarro was the conquistador that destroyed that empire. Also, disease will decimate the local populations by the end of the 1500s. It almost wipes them out. So to answer that question, the legacy in the Americas of the Europeans is conquest and disease. Going back to Columbus, they thought that they had discovered the East for a time, and that's why the inhabitants came to be called Indians by the Europeans. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand instituted the encomienda system, where those that are trying to colonize the Native Americans will care for their material and spiritual needs, but after time goes by, this is really largely ignored. It is bare minimum needs that are being met. They are basically worked to the point of death on plantations. Not just sugar plantations, but also tobacco plantations in southeast, what is today the southeast United States. They found that these crops grew very, very well there, and there is a huge demand for them. And Europeans became addicted to tobacco and chocolate, and they never could have enough of these commodities. And if the work didn't kill them, laboring and European diseases like smallpox would. A positive influence of the expansion into the Americas was the so-called Columbian Exchange. And those are items that came from America to the Europeans. Corn and potatoes greatly improved the European diets, and it helped them to recover from the Black Death. From Europe to the Americas, livestock is a huge, huge influence, especially on the Plains Indians in North America. They no longer hunted with dogs. They started to use horses, and now they had a much greater territory that they could cover and hunt the bison with. Be familiar with corn and potatoes from the Americas to the Europeans, not just tobacco and tomatoes and some other viney crops that grow. And from Europe to the Americas, diseases, horses, and coffee grew very well in the Americas. Eventually, Spain is going to have competition from the English and the Dutch in the 17th century, and also the slave trade continues to increase with the implementation of the encomienda system, the plantation system in North America. It's going to need laborers because there's no supply. The Native Americans have largely died out. In Asia, the Dutch and the English soon challenged the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean. The Netherlands and England formed the East India Company to make treaties, to raise money and armies, and to establish and direct trade throughout Asia. The Dutch East India Company was more powerful in Southeast Asia, in Java and in Indonesia. The English focused more on India after the Dutch came to dominate Southeast Asia. Also, in North America, they took over New Netherland and they named it New York after the King James. In Africa, this indigenous African nation were the main Portuguese rivals in the Gold Coast trade. The Portuguese are the first to settle in southern Africa. Slave trade and its effects on African practices. Slavery is believed to be as old as civilization itself. The Islamic empires practiced slavery. The difference in the Americas is that slavery became hereditary. It became race-based, whereas in other parts of the world it was not. Slaves could have slaves. Slaves could purchase their freedom. That was not so in the Americas. There was a need for slaves because of the severe labor shortage after the death from smallpox and other diseases, mainly sexually transmitted diseases that didn't exist in the Americas. Here you have some of the statistics. If you're interested, you can go through them. The middle leg was the part of the slave trade where the slaves were being transported across the Atlantic. There would be guns, rum, and other supplies crossing the Atlantic to Africa, slaves in the hold on the way back, and then they would then transport other supplies back to Europe. Never travel empty if you're a shipper. And here are some of the items that came from Europe to Africa. A lot of guns, slaves to the Caribbean, and then these commodity products that are being grown on the plantations. 20% of the slaves died during passage, and those that made it did very well compared to Europeans in the Caribbean because they have immunity to yellow fever and they're not really affected by malaria as bad as Europeans were. And in the summertime, those were deadly diseases into the 20th century until they figured out that mosquitoes were transmitting these diseases. Life was harsh for slaves. Obviously, they tried to cope with those various methods. Depopulation were some of the effects. In Africa, families are torn apart, and some of those trading empires came to be conquered by other Africans, leading to problems between nation groups in Africa that exist to this day. Africans enslaved Africans. And here are some other details about the spice trade in Southeast Asia. Christianity will only be successful in the Philippines. Buddhism and Islam are more influential in Southeast Asia. We've already talked about that. Be familiar with these titles. The Javanese had kings. The Islamic rulers were called sultans. Vietnamese emperors or kings is also used but the Vietnamese tended to emulate the Chinese. Commerce is beginning to affect the daily life because of all of this trade. Nuclear families predominated. And that's it for chapter 14.